Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books that I have recently finished reading. Today I'm going to talk about 3 books that I read in the beginning of the month of November. The books are The Great Leveler, Forever Nerdy, and Tales from the Haunted South. I'll talk about them in the order in which I read them. Now, November is nonfiction November in the booktube community. And even though I mostly read nonfiction anyway, like the 80 or 90% of what I read is nonfiction, I decided to still take part because I have, it's kind of behind the shoulder over here, a general nonfiction section that I have largely been neglecting. I read a lot of nonfiction history, but I started pulling from that shelf this month. So I'm going to be talking about a few things. I actually have a couple history things, which is very typical for me, and something that is fairly atypical. And I will, over the next few days, hopefully be making some more Fresh Red Kills videos, catching up on some things that I've been reading since these 3, because I've actually had a very, very productive reading month. More than usual. I don't know what it is. I'm getting through a lot of books lately. Here's the next 3 that I'll talk about when I make that video, hopefully this weekend. So anyhow, to continue on, the first book that I read, or at least finished in November, I began this at the end of October. It's a chunker. This is The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century by Walter Scheidel. This is from Princeton University Press. I had gotten this in a book haul earlier this year, in which I ordered from Princeton University's very good sale that they have usually twice a year. Now, I ordered that when I was on a book buying ban, which I'm once again on. It was a shorter one this time. And part of my penance for that was really, I was going to read the books before the end of the year. And this is really the last one that I have to read. There is one more that was part of that book haul, but it is more appropriate for next year. So I'm just holding it there. But this is the last one that I had to really get through this year to keep my word on that vow. And this falls into quarter 4 of Historathon, which is a year-long reading event that I created, but I also have some great co-hosts going along with me, where we read, discuss, and celebrate nonfiction history throughout the year. And we split the year up into 4 quarters, and we are currently in the 4th quarter, which looks at the years 1820 to the present day. And essentially, we just read nonfiction history that falls within that time period. And this is that, but it is also very much a world history. You can see the subtitle here, Violence and History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century, and it keeps its word on that. This bounces all over in time, all the way back from the Neolithic Age to the present day. Now, the title and subtitle of this, and also I think a pretty awesome looking cover design, they do sort of suggest a juicier read than this really is. And I'm not disparaging this book. It's just that when I bought it, I didn't realize how deeply of an economic book it is, first of all. And also it does very narrowly focus on income inequality, not really other types of inequality. And Scheidel is very clear on that. Right from the very beginning inside the introduction, he acknowledges there's many different types of inequality, but he is focusing on income inequality. And you don't get a lot of detail when it comes to things like the violence. It's very kind of briefly mentioned throughout each section. And he is looking at first, maybe, essentially his overall finding is that income inequality, does seem to be a fairly natural state in man. He is not advocating for it or saying that it's right at all. It's just, it existed ever since the beginning of time, it seems, and, is still with us today. And the only things that level it, really to any substantial degree, tend to be violent upheavals. And he has 4, he calls them the 4 horsemen. These are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for his purposes. And the 4 things that will level income and bring about income equality are war, especially the mass mobilization of armies, revolution, the collapse of the state, and finally plague and famine, or really plague and disease. And so what he does is he looks at those four horsemen and he sees essentially how they leveled things, or at least not exactly how they leveled it, but he proves that they leveled it. This is a very, very data-driven book. Like I said, it's not like a juicy page turner. It is very well researched, very thorough in its research, and it has got lots of data, lots of numbers. We also get all kinds of charts and graphs, things like this. If you love graphs, you're gonna love this. They're all over the place in here. And you know, I'm a lover of history, but I have to say, economic history is certainly not my favorite thing to read. I really love social history. And this is very much, like I said, an economic history. There's really no social history whatsoever in this. It's still valuable. It's still incredibly interesting. And it gets very technical. It's very economic. Now, you don't have to have an advanced economics degree to understand what he's talking about here. He does a pretty good job of explaining it and laying it all out. I would, however, suggest that if you wanted to read something like this, you have a good background in world history, because he bounces all over the place geographically and also in terms of time period and events. Luckily, the majority of civilizations or events that he talked about, I have at least some background in. But like, for instance, one of them I didn't really. When he talks about something like, for instance, the Han Dynasty, he can give me all sorts of numbers about income inequality, but because I don't have a real firm background into what that income would mean, you know, what was the lifestyle like, they were just kind of numbers to me that I can compare. I didn't get a sense of really what that society was going through or what it was like. And, you know, so income inequality and looking at those numbers, it's certainly valuable, but it can kind of only tell you so much sometimes without having that social history background, right? The top 10% in pre-revolutionary Russia, it's going to be a very different world than the top 10% in the Inca Empire, right? So it does help to have a background with all of that. Like I said, I definitely found this valuable, and I'm glad that I read it. It is, I think, almost a little bit, and this sounds weird, but almost a little bit too dense with data, where, you know, you can kind of make a point and then it stretches on and on with all these examples and all this data, and even some counter data that doesn't necessarily prove his thesis, you know. Sometimes it goes against it, you kind of exhaust that as well. I felt like a lot of that stuff could maybe have been moved to like an appendix in the back or something like that. You know, I felt like some of the data could have been put elsewhere and made accessible, but just to kind of keep the flow of the reading more. So I would recommend this to people who, again, have a firm background in world history and who really like reading about economics and data crunching and all of that. You know, it's a valuable book. I think it's a good book. I think it's good history. But, you know, and it just not even, you know, just to say that, you know, as much as you exhaust a subject like income inequality, without having the context of other types of inequality, I don't know if you can really get a clear picture. And I don't think he would not deny that. I mean, he kind of addresses that in the introduction. But like, for instance, the Russian Revolution certainly leveled the playing field in terms of income inequality. But when you have millions of people, you know, dying from forced labor, there's obviously major inequality still occurring inside that society. So, yeah, you know, glad I read it. It was not necessarily a page turner. I kind of had to plow my way through it, force myself to go through it, but still, nevertheless, good history. And then after that, I really kind of needed a break. I needed something that was very much on the opposite end. So I grabbed a book from my general nonfiction shelf, something that had been sitting there for a while. I had picked this up, Forever Nerdy, Living My Dorky Dreams and Staying Metal by Brian Posehn. Maybe like 2 years ago or something like that, from Hamilton Books. I think it was $1. So I saw it super cheap and thought, yeah, okay. And he's a comedian that I've enjoyed in the past, and he has a lot of, I guess, nerdy interests that align with mine. So I thought this could be fun, and I'll give it a try. And I was especially actually interested in what he had to say about growing up growing up a nerd before nerd culture was mainstream. I kind of wanted a little bit more insight into that. I lived through some of that, but he's more than 10 years older than me, so it would be more interesting to hear from him, like growing up in the 70s or 80s, that sort of thing. So this is very much, of course, a very different book than The Great Leveler, which I needed, right? I just kind of needed a palate cleanser. And it's a very swift read, although I did also kind of listen to this. I listened to it as well, the audiobook version, which he reads. And I don't ever just listen to an audiobook. I always have to have a physical copy of the book that I can go back and forth to. I get to hear his voice, and then sometimes I do immersive reading, or sometimes I'll listen, I'll go back and read through, look at things like the various pictures that he posts, or other things that he has inside the book. So, and it was nice to hear him, especially because he's a comedian. You can kind of hear his inflection, and I think it probably brings out the humor and the writing more in his delivery. So I would recommend, certainly, if you wanted this, I would recommend the audiobook overall. So what he is looking at is his, basically it's an autobiography, mostly of the first 20 years or so. His adult life, he goes through pretty swiftly. It's mostly about his childhood and his teenage years. And I actually found this stuff to be really interesting. There's actually some surprising things in his life that, that made for an overall compelling read. Now, he defines being nerdy as having an interest that you are obsessive with, that you really deep dive. You're not a nerd if you like things passively, right? Nerds are passionate, and they are active, and they like to, nitpick and deep dive, and that's kind of what he's talking about here. And I certainly am that way with certain things. I mean, I have a booktube channel, so obviously I'm a big book nerd. I co-host a horror movie discussion podcast. I'm a big horror movie nerd, and he is also a horror nerd. So to kind of demonstrate his nerdiness, and not just talk about how he's a nerd, but show that he's a nerd, in addition to chapters about his life, he also breaks it up, with chapters about his nerdy obsessions. So there is a chapter, for instance, dedicated to him being a Kiss fan, and how that came about. And a lot of these things are, about how he loves something at one point, and then he kind of grows out of love with them because of, their marketing or the turns they take. That's true for Star Wars as well, not surprisingly. But he talks about being a metalhead, growing to be a metal nerd. I also do like metal quite a bit. I'm not quite nerd level as him, but that was fun to read. And horror nerd, that was fun. Now, that also, I think, would mean that people who don't have nerdy interests that align with his aren't going to get as much out of the book. Like, for instance, he's a huge Rush fan. I appreciate and I respect the musical abilities of Rush. That's undeniable. But I've never connected with their music. So to have a whole chapter about Rush, it just isn't going to be quite as interesting to me. It's not a long chapter. None of these chapters are really that long. But, just to be aware of that. But yeah, overall, I did enjoy this. I thought it was quite a bit of fun. It was a nice kind of swift book to get through, especially after going through The Great Leveler. And I feel like that's actually kind of the perfect time to read it. And the last one I'm going to talk about is this. A fairly thin work from University of North Carolina Press. This is Tales from the Haunted South, Dark Tourism and Memories of Slavery from the Civil War Era by Tiya, I'm not sure, Miles. Now, I already mentioned I'm a horror fan. Horror studies is something that I do like to read. I am also have particular interest in hauntings. I don't believe in ghosts, but I am fascinated by ghost stories and about how we use ghosts to sort of remember the past. Sometimes it's past traumas. Sometimes it is, essentially ghosts are the past refusing to be forgotten in the present. They intrude on the present and demand to be addressed and noticed. And that's kind of true for this. So this looks at dark tourism, especially ghost tours. And she's specifically looking at slavery and ghost tours, and more specifically, black female slaves really is the focus here, and how they come about in these various tours that she takes, whether it be house tours or city tours, whatever it might be. So, this is interesting to me in a number of ways, right? So it's the ghost aspect. I actually like travel writing as well. It falls into there. And this has a lot to do also with historical memory and how we choose to remember the past, and sometimes very inaccurately. So some of the things that she finds as she goes through tours, she does tours in Savannah. I think she does a quick one in Charleston, which I've done ghost tours in Charleston before, and that's pretty fun. Like, I should say that, I have taken a lot of ghost tours, and once again, I don't believe in ghosts necessarily, but I do find ghost tours to be fun, and sometimes they're better than others. The best ghost tours that I've been on have a good helping of history, right? It's like 90% history and 10% ghost story. I've taken one in Gettysburg that I felt was more like that. That was fun. And I've been on ones that are much more corny and cheesy, and they're always talking about the orbs and photos, and they're trying to make it spooky, and that gets pretty corny. But nevertheless, when I go with my family to a new location, usually on the first night, if we can, we try and take a ghost tour. I feel like you get a sense of the historical memory of the folklore, and as you're traveling around the area, you get a really good sense of the landmarks and what shortcuts there are to take. It just kind of gives you a mental geography of the place pretty well. So it kind of gives you, like I said, a sense of the place, as far as its character, its past, and also just its physical makeup. So, and I got a little sidetracked there, but she takes one ghost tour again in Savannah, in New Orleans, and she also goes to the Myrtles Plantation as well, which has featured a lot on haunted programs on television. And she finds certain things that crop up a lot. A lot of stories about abused female slaves, most of which end up being wholly invented from whole cloth. Really not a shred of historical evidence to support a lot of these things. And she does find some things that are a little bit, retro or regressive, maybe we could say, as far as how we should be looking at these historical figures. Some tours kind of revel a little bit in the abuse a little bit more. Sometimes they align to certain old stereotypes that would be better off forgotten. Nevertheless, they are, at least at the time that she wrote this, this was published in 2015, they were really one of the only types of tours that were really addressing slavery, and especially female slaves in their lives. So even if things were invented, it was one of the few places that tourists could go to actually find stories about them. And she does acknowledge that a lot of good could probably come from these types of ghost tours, if they could, do it more properly. So there's a mix of, almost hope that things could get a little bit better, and that, she's not against haunted tours at all. In this, she actually comes out, in some ways liking them, but being disturbed or dismayed by how they currently are. And she does not come from, unlike a lot of people who do, I think, this type of research, she does not come from a world immersed in ghost stories or the supernatural or like sometimes horror studies. She kind of fell into this, and you can kind of get a sense, and there are times when I felt like she could have pushed maybe a little bit further in her research, in her experience, even in her analysis, like, why do people invent these types of stories from whole cloth? And she doesn't really get into that exactly. She's more concerned with how these stories can be used today, and looking at the real history, if there is any, about the events. And she also has, obviously, she is dealing with race. Sometimes I feel like it's a little bit gratuitous with how much race plays a part. Like, for instance, every time she takes a tour, she gives us a detailed makeup of the kind of race or ethnicity of all the people in the tour, but it's not clear to what end. I'm assuming that she's trying to show us there's not a lot of African Americans on these tours, but she doesn't really get into it. So she lets me know when there's like lesbian couples, or if there's like one Asian guy, or if they're mostly white. But she doesn't do much with that information. So she does it several times, and I'm not entirely sure what she's doing that for. But anyway, that's a small quibble. Overall, I liked it. There wasn't a lot that was surprising to me necessarily. I did like, especially the ending and her little more hopeful look at ghost tourism. But yeah, I mean, dark tourism is something that I think is quite interesting. It's something that has come about in the last maybe 20 or so years. People looking for, basically exploring spots where tragedy had occurred. I've always been interested in ghosts and ghost stories. At one point I believed in them. But dark tourism in general is definitely a fascinating topic. And I do think that ghosts and ghost tours are one way that people maybe feel like they experience the past in a more immediate way. If you walk through an old house, whether or not you think ghosts are there in reality, you can almost feel the past. I think that's part of it. It's a connection that people can have, potentially with history. So I'm not against ghost tours either. I do think that they can be incredibly cheesy, but I do think that they should strive to show the history in an accurate way. So anyhow, that's just my thoughts on this. So those are the 3 books that I read in the very beginning of November. This is kind of rambly. It's been a few weeks actually now since I've finished these, or at least a little over a week. So my memory gets a little bit rusty sometimes because I don't get to these videos right away. But yeah, it's my hobby. I do it whenever I can. So the 3 books that I have read, or I did read in the beginning of November, it was The Great Leveler, Forever Nerdy, and then lastly, Tales from the Haunted South. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.